We hold these truths to be self-evident. Corporations are not people. Money is not speech. This is not a Christian nation. And the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. Welcome to Disorderly Conduct. All right, folks, welcome to another episode of the Disorderly Conduct podcast. I am your host for this week, Fingers. I am an accountant by day, a working musician by night, enthusiastic amateur economist in my spare time, and a concerned citizen 24. So with that, I'll let the rest of the panel introduce themselves.
I guess I'll go second. What's up, guys? It's Jesse again. IT guy by day, concerned citizen by night. Like to consider myself an armchair historian. Just fighting back against fascism and this authoritarian regime.
And I'm Joey, retired Green Beret, officially now, guys. So very happy about that and very concerned about the direction of the country. Patriot, and I'll hand it over to Bobby.
Hey guys, I'm Bobby, civil litigation attorney in Georgia, advocate, organizer, you name it.
So before we talk about systems, statistics, or studies, let's talk about a person. Imagine walking into a hospital scared, in pain, and vulnerable, doing exactly what you're told that you're supposed to do. You explain what you're feeling, you ask for help, and instead of being believed, you're questioned, dismissed, maybe even ignored. For many people, especially Black patients, that experience isn't rare, routine. Pain is minimized. Symptoms are second-guessed. Concerns are chalked up to anxiety, exacerbations, or attitude. And sometimes the consequences are devastating. Complications, long-term harm, even death. We like to think of medicine and science in general as neutral, scientific, objective, a place where facts matter more than feelings. But healthcare doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists inside the same society shaped by history, power, and inequality. The story we're opening with today isn't about one bad doctor or one tragic mistake. It's about a pattern, one that shows up across hospitals, clinics, emergency rooms, and maternity wards. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. This is an episode about medical racism, where it comes from, how it shows up today, and why ignoring it costs lives. And so for the panel, when people hear medical racism, what do you think they picture and what do they miss?
They definitely miss racism that is built into medical education. I'll say that.
By this point, I think I'm going to be known for it because what would an episode of Disorderly Conduct be without bringing up on freedom, right? And I'll just take it back to Tim Snyder's experience with a dear friend when he almost died in the hospital, and that dear friend happened to be Black and was a physician and was asking for the doctors there to help him. And she, as a medical professional, despite him being a white man, was disregarded, which I think is another powerful example of how race can impact even the most educated among us.
Yeah, I think what people think of generally tends to be incorrect. Usually the public tend to be incorrect about a lot of things. And I think what they think of is they picture like 1920s, like, no N-words allowed kind of thing. It's just like, that's just not, that's not how this works kind of thing, right? We can have, I'm sure we're going to get into this, but we can have institutions that perpetuate these things, right? Intentionally or unintentionally is probably the biggest point. But I think what people generally think of is there's no doctor out there saying, I'm not going to help you because you're Black. You know what I mean? It's like, I think people have an incorrect understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about racial disparities today in things like healthcare systems.
I think they also tend to blame people. Are you sure it's not because they're poor, or they're fat, or they're this, or they're that? I mean, it's not because they're eating hamburgers and drink, like.
Yeah. And, part of the reason why I selected this is I feel like this is a good entry point for people to truly understand structural racism, systemic racism, right? And understand that as just you said it, Jesse, right? Racism is not exclusively some guy saying, I'm not going to serve you. And structural racism does not mean a bunch of those people running around, right? Structural racism is literally, this is the way the system is shaped, folks. And even people inside that system who are doing their best to be free of bias will be forced into bias by the system if they're not actively looking for bias and looking for ways to correct it, right? So when people hear the phrase medical racism, the first reaction is often defensive. Let me correct that sentence. When white people hear the phrase medical racism, the first reaction is often defensive. They imagine someone accusing every doctor or nurse of being openly racist, and that's not what this is about. Jesse got there before us, obviously. Medical racism isn't primarily about personal hatred or intent. It's about systems. It's about patterns. It's about what happens when race-based assumptions are baked into medical training, medical research, medical policy, and everyday clinical decision-making. Medical racism shows up when some patients are believed and others aren't. When pain is taken seriously for one group and minimized for another. When access to care, quality of treatment, and health outcomes fall predictably along racial lines, even when income, education, and insurance are the same. It's also about what medicine chooses to study and what it ignores. Who gets included in clinical trials, whose bodies are treated as the default, and whose are treated as deviations. You don't need racist doctors for racist outcomes. You need unchecked assumptions, flawed data, and systems that reward speed and efficiency over listening. So when we talk about medical racism, we're not talking about morality. We're talking about accountability and whether a system designed to heal is actually doing harm. And so a couple of examples, race in kidney testing. There's a medical term here, EGFR. I'm not going to pretend I know what that means. It's not really relevant for the point here. How neutral math changes care. For years, many labs used an EGFR equation that included a race adjustment for Black patients, which would make kidney function look better on paper, potentially delaying diagnosis, referral, or eligibility for transplant wait lists. And in 2021, an NKF/ASN task force recommended using a race-free equation. This is the 2021 CKD EPI creatinine equation, and encouraged confirmatory testing. And this comes from the National Kidney Foundation. Second one, Henrietta Lacks was a Black woman treated for cervical cancer at Johns Hopkins in 1951 and had tissue samples taken during treatment without her knowledge or consent. Common practice at the time, but part of a larger pattern where marginalized patients had less agency in medical settings. Her cells, GLA, became foundational for biomedical research. Johns Hopkins' own FAQ explains the historical context and lack of consent practices in that era. So, for the panel, when does bias become racism, and who gets to define that line?
Well, one of the things that stood out to me, and I'll just draw on personal experience here a little bit. For those of you that are listening and not watching, I am a Black American, and I spent over 20 years in the military. One of the things that I found out early on, right, and I'm just telling you the facts here. So I'm a very, very fit member of special operations, right? And they have a method of measuring BMI. And what I found out later in life was that method almost entirely was developed with a white sample, which is fine, right? We make up 17% of the U.S. population, and as you said, in 2021 we just started adjusting practices. So my expectation is managed. But what I will say is that was I think it demonstrates that you talk about an outcome being racist, right, as opposed to the people driving it being racist. And that's what I think one of the things that we have to acknowledge. You have to understand that, these are things that are meaningful in your career. BMI or your fitness in the military is measured, and it is something that you can be put out of the military for. And so now we can see where my BMI, despite me being fit and my measurements being in check, right, they're not accounting for the difference in bone density between races because they don't have enough of a sample size. Nonetheless, the outcome is still one that is very racist. I think that's kind of something that I see. So hopefully that answers some of your question.
Well, I think it's when it becomes systemic. I mean, I'm not like women with blonde hair, right? But if women with blonde hair consistently treated poorly, pressed, murdered, not given pain medication, what have you, then that's when you see like what most people have the definition of racism as today. Like, of course, there's like the Webster's Dictionary hierarchy based on race, right? But most of us know it today as a sociological definition, which are, systematic oppression based on hierarchy. So I think that's
I think if I could add an extra layer of definition, I guess, I would say bias becomes racism when the bias is used to create a second class citizen category. Because using the ability to see all individuals as equal citizens would assume that equal protections of the law would be equally applied. But if you have a class of secondary citizens, of lower class citizens, not on paper, but by practice, you can effectively use the bias for systems of power against the race. Right. And I would argue this is why Eric Foner calls the Reconstruction the unfinished revolution in American history, which I completely agree. It's a revolution that was never sought to completion. It was never completed. It unfortunately just dissipated, and we had state and Supreme Court regressive rulings. But the point I'm trying to make is, to your question, Fingers, I think when we effectively on the books and in practicality have a second class citizenry, this is by definition oppression, right? When there is only one definition of citizenship, that all equal protections of the law must apply, but we don't see that, right? And I think that's
Yeah.
what I would add to that.
And I think pivoting off of that, or the thing that brings to mind, is when something like this, which we could charitably describe as blind spots, right? But then become looked at as, hey, this is science. This is justification for bias elsewhere that is perhaps not medical or not scientific. But we can point at these kinds of things, and if we have unexamined assumptions about them, for example, I will bet you somewhere out there is some white supremacist spouting rhetoric about how African Americans have higher rates of obesity based on bad BMI data, right? I will bet you there's something along those lines somewhere. And so I guess my answer would be, when bias goes unexamined, right? Whether through privilege, whether through conscious decision, whether through a lack of priority to make sure that systems are equitable for all citizens, or all people, then that's the point at which bias becomes racism, because we've allowed innate bias to start to perpetuate a two or multi-class system.
Well, I think it's also the lack of examination, right? Again, going back to, okay, it's a white sample. That's what we've got, right? That's at that time, I think, 65, 70% of America, right? But when you examine the outcome, right, and you do nothing about it, that's when I think it becomes racist, right? You have to acknowledge, hey, this is how it was established. Here's the impact. What do we think this is? And if you're honest, right, you should intellectually come up with, hey, we've got to change how we arrive, or we've got to change the outcome through our pattern here. What we're actually doing. I think that's the thing, and I think that's the difficulty, right? Because as soon as you say there's systemic racism here, what they hear is, you're calling me a racist. And what we're saying is not that. We're saying there are racist outcomes, and we have to examine where they come from. And if we do that intellectually, it's not an assault on your character. In fact, it's an opportunity for you to look up and say, oh man, I didn't know that. I didn't see that before. And man, this impact is really unacceptable if I believe in equality, right? So let's adjust how we review data. Let's adjust how we give care, because these outcomes are not acceptable.
And one last thing to kind of add on top of that, and I think this is important for us going forward with what Fingers wants to present, is the idea that a law does not have to be explicit in its letter to be unjust in its application. The majority of Jim Crow laws, for example, were written in race-neutral language. So most of them, not all, most of them did not mention the word black, right? But it obviously implied this idea that if you come to the voting booth, you got to take a literacy test. Oh, you got to pay that poll tax. You got to get past these guys with guns, right? So we need to be very genuine when we approach this subject, because we're not going to find books in the law or laws in the books. They're going to outright say these people are excluded, these people are not. But in application, it can absolutely happen. And this is what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know the full story, and I haven't investigated every detail of the EQR formula, the kidney black adjustment factor thing. that I brought up as an example, right? Like, I'm not a medical historian and we only have so much time to cover here. But the very fact that such an adjustment exists tells me that somebody looked at the data and said, we're getting something different for the Black population than we are from the white population. And the underlying assumption is we just need to correct for something rather than dig deeper, right? And as somebody who's a skeptic and tries to think about the scientific method in a rigorous way, that offends me. That's sloppy. That's bad science, right? That's fudging the data, literally. That's when you say, oh, this part of my experiment doesn't tell me what I expected to see, therefore let me adjust the data. That's not science, right? That becomes propaganda. That becomes deciding the end of the sentence and then, retrofitting the words before it to arrive where you want to go. Unfortunately, Bobby dropped technically because I wanted to make this point. This is not purely about race, the issue of, a lot of this data being formed by white men, because BMI specifically was also built on white men. And so women are often told they're obese because the tables that are being used to tell them they're obese were developed on a different gender, you know? So again, unexamined bias. And we could say the same thing about patriarchy that we're saying about racism, right? And, to your point about people getting upset that they're called racist, the problem with a lot of white people is they're more upset about being called racist than they are at the fact that racism exists, right? And so when you hear about systemic racism, if you want to not be racist and you want people to not think you're racist, the response is to go, oh yeah, let's look at that. Let's figure out how we get justice for that, instead of, you're calling me a racist because I haven't looked at this in the past, right? Being an anti-racist is not a conversion event. You don't suddenly become anti-racist and then all is clear sailing from then on. It's a matter of constantly having your shoulders of the flywheel, examining unexamined assumptions, figuring out where you have blind spots. This episode started because I was not confronted, but some woman in Alive, African-American woman in Alive, mentioned something about medical racism, and I had a blind spot around it. There was new news, which I'll share with you later in this topic, that I hadn't even considered. And it was like, oh, work for me again. Time to go back, clock in the morning, figure out what my bias was. Where did I miss this? How did I miss this? And try to rectify it. And the result for me is this episode, right? So a lot of people want to believe that whatever in the past is exactly that, right? Which is what will drive some of those, I'm not a racist, there's not a problem reactions, that the past is the past, but the data tells a different story. So today, Black patients are still less likely to receive adequate pain management. Black women are significantly more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications, regardless of income or education. Diagnostic tools and medical devices are still calibrated in ways that work better for lighter skin. These aren't anecdotes. They're consistent findings across studies, hospitals, and states. They even persist even when doctors genuinely believe they're treating everyone the same. And that's what makes this so dangerous. Bias doesn't have to announce itself. It can operate quietly through split-second judgments, standardized protocols, and algorithms that look neutral but reflect unequal realities. When a system produces the same unequal outcomes over and over again, that's not coincidence, that's structure. The question isn't whether medical racism exists. The question is why we're still debating it while people are suffering the consequences in real time. And so one of the case studies, like I alluded to it just a second ago, pulse oximeters and skin tone. There's device bias with real-world stakes. FDA has acknowledged that pulse oximeter performance, which is the thing they put on your finger to just measure how much oxygen is in your blood, can differ across skin pigmentation. In retrospect, right? And has proposed updated recommendations to improve accuracy in testing across skin tones. And this one, for me, again, is important because I like to think scientifically. I like to think about controlling variables. Well, what if this is about class? What if this is not so much about race as it is about socioeconomic status? What is this is less about African Americans' access to good health outcomes, and it's about poor people's access to good health outcomes. Serena Williams, postpartum. She was dismissed even when she was right. So she has described recognizing symptoms consistent with pulmonary embolism postpartum and pushing for imaging and getting attention. And Mount Sinai summarized her experience as an example of postpartum complications and challenges that can include immediately not being heard. So, needless to say, Serena Williams is not in a lower socioeconomic class. She has plenty of money. This is not about wealth versus poor. This is about a racial disparity, right? So we already talked about the EGFR race adjustment, baked in, and
Yeah.
it's strong evidence because it wasn't just one clinic. It's a widely used equation, and yet it went unexamined until 2021.
If I may, I think you make a good point, and I think if we were to go down the road of debating that this is a question of socioeconomics, poor, or rather, class rather than race, it leads us back to race. When we look at the history of the Black community and the Hispanic community and minority communities, it is a history of intentionally impoverishing them, right? So if we talk about class, it will bring us back to race because this is what the systems have done. We could talk about redlining. We could talk about the criminal justice system from state to federal authorities and laws being passed that intentionally kept the Black community, particularly the Black community, in segregated areas of their cities. One of the greatest books that could be read on this, as I've recommended before, right next to me, Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. He does a phenomenal job. This is one of the books that every page is another example. He's like, oh, here's another example. Oh, here's another example. Here's another example. Here's another example. Every single page is another example. So if we're going to make the argument that it has to do with class, then we got to look at which racial group was pushed into that class.
Yeah. I mean, and I think the thing that leaps to mind, the opioid epidemic was an epidemic, right? It's a public health crisis. The crack epidemic was a problem of violence in the Black community. This is the same thing. This was drugs that were brought into the country and released for purposes of profit, one legally, one not legally. And the victims of that had similar socioeconomic status, right? Different parts of the country, but still poor people. One is a public health crisis. One is a problem within that community that they can't seem to stop killing each other.
Well, yeah. And I mean, it was so funny because we started talking about outcomes. And the first thing that leapt to mind for me was a crime bill, right? Which largely a byproduct of the crack epidemic, as we know, right? And what happened with opioids, right? Was it not the pharmaceutical company that was getting away with it that ultimately still has gotten away with it, right? And it's still, like you say, a public health crisis instead of changing scheduling. And then, you look at the crime bill that comes out, okay, we're going to do something big. And then the outcome of that is awful. How long did it take for us to repeal that? I mean, people realized it pretty quick, right? I think the crime bill was 94. By 97, people were like, okay, guys, like this is not having the effect we wanted. When did we take care of that problem finally? I mean, come on.
Super predators, my favorite president.
Super predator. I was just
Clinton. Yeah. And just to pivot off, the Sackler family has still not really paid for what they did to the country with the opioid epidemic. And it really does come down pretty much to one family, right? And to the point of like affecting systems, this is the point, like they went and got in front of doctors and told them that this product was safe, told them that they had figured out how to make the narcotic time release. And because it was time release, therefore it's not addictive. Well, of course, they never provide studies or did science to show that just because something is hitting your system in a slower rate, that the physically addictive properties are no longer there. And the thing that gets me when I looked at it, saw a documentary about this, that is the most insidious, is they actually would show doctors a chart where they would show in the bloodstream, okay, here's the level of the narcotic in the bloodstream. As you can see, this is slightly elevated, but this is actually a very flat curve. Except in very small print, it's a logarithmic scale, which means that if it had been on a true scale, like we're used to seeing things where you had the same, where each tick going upwards had the same value, this curve would have looked like your traditional bell curve. But because they use the logarithmic scale, higher values looked smaller on the graph. So it's deliberately misleading. But doctors had this in front of them. It became part of the medical system, right? Anyway. So how bias actually shows up. Bias in medicine rarely looks like slurs or outright hostility. I mean, we're made this point a couple of times now. It looks like assumptions, shortcuts, stories doctors tell themselves about who a patient is and what they're likely experiencing. There are persistent myths like the idea that Black people feel less pain or exaggerate symptoms or are more likely to be drug seeking. These beliefs are false, but they've been passed down through training, culture, and informal mentorship. Bias also shows up in time. Who gets listened to, who gets interrupted, who gets additional testing versus reassurance and dismissal. And increasingly, bias shows up in technology. Algorithms used to determine care, risk, and insurance coverage are trained on historical data that already reflects inequality. When you automate bias, you scale it. Now, none of this requires malicious intent. It just requires a system that doesn't stop to ask, why do these patterns keep repeating? When bias goes unexamined, it becomes policy. So, case study, the pain myth as inherited medical folklore. A recurring thread across historical and modern examples is the myth that Black patients feel less pain or tolerate more pain, used historically to justify neglect and, in some accounts, experimentation. AI's historical overview of Sims experimentation, we'll get into who Sims was shortly, discusses the medical exploitation context that helped embed such ideas. Technology scaling inequality, like the pulse ox is an example. Even if no clinician intends harm, a biased tool can shape decisions, can shape triage, oxygen supplementation, and discharge versus admission. FDA actions show this being treated as a performance and evidence problem, not just bad bedside behavior. So where would you guys say the myths live today? In training, culture, time pressure, documentation, algorithms? I know none of us are medical professionals, but we can speculate.
I mean, the answer is yes, right? The answer is, where does it exist? Yes. Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head when you were talking about that these things are trained on historical data that is already biased. It's already leaning towards a particular side, and that causes a huge discrepancy in what we're talking about.
So I think one of the things that comes to mind for me, and I'll keep circling back here because I think it's so important. It's about evaluating outcomes. If we look at the fact that the maternal mortality rate is 3.5 times higher for Black women, if we look at the fact that Black folks are 22% less likely to get pain care, essentially, right? If we start looking at those outcomes, you have one or two options. You can say, well, I mean, that's just what the data shows. Or you can ask the question, why is this happening? Where does it come from? And I think that the points that you brought up, Fingers, are all points that we have to evaluate in determining these outcomes. It may be true that culture doesn't have anything to do with this specific thing. It may be true that, this factor doesn't have anything to do with this specific outcome. There may be some things that we look at where all of those factors play into the outcome. I think we just have to honestly assess it, and using good science instead of junk science is the way we do that.
No worries. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Jesse. Again, we're not medical professionals. The cynic in me says all of the above, and as we're seeing, like everywhere in the chain, there's evidence for bias. And again, I thought this is really good entry point and to help illustrate to white people who don't understand or refuse to acknowledge that systemic racism exists, and especially when you try to point to law enforcement outcomes and they're inherently resistant to the idea. Things like this in a field that is inherently more scientific, that has more science attached to it. I think that this is a good way to illustrate to people what systemic racism actually is.
And so before I cut out, and even to add on to your point, the authority assigned in this area and other areas is significant, right? Because even like you said, even when you control for socioeconomic status, education, like women are still dying on the table, having kids, Black women, at an exponential rate to white women. So why, right? Because you just won't listen when they say something's wrong. Well, your BMI, whoop de whoop, your blood pressure. Okay, who gives a shit about that? Cause or not cause, right? You should focus a lot less on trying to tell her what to eat, what not to eat, or how to weigh, and treating something that's killing her. and it's wild to see it still today. And it's, I think I know in the spaces we're in, I think people talk about it, but a lot of people aren't talking about it because when you talk about closing the disparities, you will hear, the victim mentality. You'll hear irresponsible with money, whatever you want for like disparities in, intergenerational wealth, homeownership, etc. Black women aren't like, you know what, today's a good day to die on the fucking having a baby. You know what I mean? You don't victimhood yourself. So how do y'all, not y'all, but how do you explain that away as if it's not a problem that is inherent in our nation and our medical system? And I would be remiss if I didn't point this out. In one of the EOs, and I don't have the number at the top of my head, but there's the one about DEI and basically accrediting institutions for medical schools and law schools. And in the middle of the EO is language that attacks the promotion of equality, right? Equity, diversity in law schools and medical schools. And when you talk about attacking the powerhouse of a community, doctors and lawyers matter significantly. Black doctors give Black people better care because it's not that they went through a different education system and never saw the racist medical education, but it's because they are more willing to see that person as a person and listen to intuition and symptoms and to care. Same thing with lawyers. Black lawyers matter. I actually have a shirt that says that. Like law student association. I won't get too far off topic, but we all know, right? Bias in the justice system. I mean, who's
Yeah.
gonna care for you more as a Black man than a Black man or woman in the legal field? Like you cannot attack the powerhouse of a community and act like that's just not racist.
Yeah, I want to expand a little bit on what you were saying, Bobby, real quick. I think it's very important to understand that we're trying to focus on the healthcare system, but it's really difficult not to mention things outside the healthcare system that affect it, because all these things are interconnected, and to assume that these things can be delineated or separated or like, oh, this is healthcare, we're not talking about this, is disingenuous, because when you intentionally remove, segregate, separate a community geographically, it makes it much more difficult for things that we consider to be so simple. Access just to their work, just to get to work, is much more difficult. Obviously, access to good work, which then affects what you can afford, which then affects, are you close to a hospital? Can you get good health care if you don't have a good job? If you live in a very impoverished area where the hospital's not nearby? Like right. And we haven't even talked about food insecurity, right? Where there is blatant evidence that, chip manufacturers and fast food advertisements are intentionally targeted specifically at children of minority racial groups because they are the number one target that buy the most junk food, which leads to obviously health conditions that come later on. These things, and I'm not trying to say we got to talk about everything else. I just want to let the listener know that these things are so interconnected.
They're inextricable, right? Okay, well, maybe it's like Burger King, liquor store. I mean, well, why is your BMI so high?
Are you saying, Joey, are you trying to tell me that separate facilities cannot be equal?
Right.
Well,
And also, I just wanted to point out for the listener that the executive order that Bobby brought up is Executive Order 14173, if you'd like to read it for yourself. Sorry, Bobby, go ahead.
They bury it in the middle, though. That's, to the extent, where, to the extent, congruent with the law, right? And then a whole bunch of illegal shit. I put in there some fluffy shit. And in the middle, it's like, did y'all see? Nobody's worried about this? Because you cannot pull it apart. It's not, and I will say this, it's not to say that bias doesn't still exist because, it's ingrained, right? In any race of person or ethnicity. But like Ron was saying in the beginning, or sorry, and I tell people this when we talk about, and this became, really clear on TikTok with liberal women, I won't name, call the names. It's not a status that you're like, yeah, I made it. It's like active listening. You know what I mean? It's something you do. It's something you understand as a lens you see things through, and you have to make sure that you're not maybe like, I guess the best analogy was rose-colored glasses. I'm not saying like you seeing it all is all rosy, but you know what I mean? Like it colors every interaction, all of the things. And you can't take, people want to talk about something as silo and act like, well, whatever. It's not a silo. That's what when you talk about systemic oppression, there is no silo. They work in congruence to prevent, or at least detract from opportunities on a mass scale. And, I guess, we could talk about one topic here and there, but when somebody tries to debate or say, well, no, we're just talking about this, that's not how it works. You don't, especially, let's say a single mom, right? Can't have access to abortion because, sanctity of life, sanctity of life, right? But then, you get 3 kids and, well, we wouldn't give you birth control because, my God, socialism. Okay, but now you got multiple children that you can't afford, and we won't raise them in wage because that's, why would we want to run the corporations out? And now, what are you? A welfare queen. Like, what the fuck? What do you want?
Yeah.
What were you
Well,
happy
we
with?
know what they want. We know what they want.
Slave labor, I mean.
They want a continuation of the status quo. They want advantage for certain people. So the thing that comes off for me, and I wanted to work it in this episode, and this seems to be the moment to do so, is we did an episode on the Doge wall of receipts, which we haven't aired yet. We're going to on the first anniversary of Doge and Musk and his cronies charging into the federal government with his famous chainsaw. And on the Doge wall of receipts, I haven't looked recently to see if it's there, but they had a section they called the greatest hits, which this is them standing up and saying, these are the most ridiculous things that this government could spend on. 4 out of 10 were funding medical studies to look at health outcomes that were different for Black folks than for white folks. One of them specifically about differences in outcomes in pregnancy for Black women. And so, I mean, I don't expect anything different from a man who grew up in a literally white supremacist state. Musk is like my age, which means that he grew up and came to his adulthood when apartheid had not yet fallen. But the fact that it's still up, well, I'm assuming that it's still up there, that this is what we're proudest of destroying. This is where medical racism becomes structural racism, becomes government policy, becomes perpetuation of harm.
And then, we systematically exclude people from access to education and status and power. And then when we say, oh man, probably should do something to remedy that. And then they're like, oh no, that's we need merit based. White man you're the original fucking DI hire.
Oh yeah.
What, you can't
The removal
compete.
of
Just say
DEI.
that. Just say you can't compete. And do something about it. But
Well, and
Removal
then
of DEI is intended to make the world safe for mediocre white men.
and it's interesting about the EO that you guys brought up, 14173. So it revokes a previous executive order by Trump, when this is something that people should pay attention to. The Trump administration issued Executive Order 13950, and it was effectively this effectively rolls back what was in 13950, which were prior efforts to promote diversity. Right, so he's flip-flopped on this. Interesting.
Yeah, it's almost like Project 2025 was a real thing.
it's almost like he was just a goddamn useful idiot. It's almost like when people say, but he wasn't like this in the first term. Yeah, no shit. He wants to avoid prison at all costs. And now has, for lack of better words, sold his soul to the devil of a train of fucking white people who want to be God.
Well, I have to just say that when Jesse was making his point earlier, Bobby, and you were just squirming and couldn't wait to jump up and say amen, was one of my most entertaining moments of today's session.
Yeah.
So I want to get into
that
I want to get into
medical that and medical and law schools, nobody seemed to notice. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm like, what the fuck? I'm sorry.
This is what is meant by reading is fundamental. So I want to talk a little bit about, we're going to circle back a little bit because I accidentally jumped ahead, but talk about the historical roots. And to understand medical racism today, we have to honest about where modern medicine came from, because history isn't just uncomfortable, it's foundational. Now, for centuries, Black, Indigenous, and marginalized people were treated not as patients, but as raw material for experimentation. Enslaved people were subjected to surgeries without anesthesia. Entire communities were used in medical studies without consent. Bodies were exploited in the name of progress. These were not fringe practices. They were mainstreamed, celebrated, taught. The knowledge gained from these abuses helped shape modern medical techniques, while the people harmed were erased from the narrative. And probably the most famous example, or the ones that listeners will be most familiar with, is the Tuskegee syphilis study. It didn't end because it was a mistake. It ended because it was exposed. Forced sterilizations did not happen in secret. They happened through policy, through paperwork, through doctors doing their jobs as instructed. And here's the key point. Systems don't magically become ethical just because time passes. If the foundations are never addressed, the biases persist, just in quieter, more professional forms. Medical racism did not disappear. It evolved. So the Tuskegee syphilis studies, for those who don't know, happened from 1932 through 1972. Deception and withholding of treatment. The U.S. Public Health Service study enrolled 399 with syphilis, 201 without, and did not obtain informed consent. Participants were told they were being treated for bad blood. There's racism right there. Not even like trying to explain this in a really medically educational way to the patient, right?
And
even after,
can we remind the listeners about the comment, poisoning the blood of America?
Yeah, true. I hadn't even made that connection. Well spotted, sir.
They're so
Even after, we'll get there. I promise everybody will get a chance. Even after penicillin became standard treatment, the study continued. And the CDC timeline documents the study's start, deception, and scope. I wonder if that is still on the CDC website, but I digress. So this is another one I talked about earlier, which is J. Marion Sims and experimentation on enslaved women. Sims is often labeled as the father of modern gynecology, but historians document what he developed surgical techniques by operating on enslaved Black women. Commonly cited are Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy, under conditions that raise profound ethical issues, including lack of consent and extreme suffering. Multiple reputable historical overviews discuss this legacy. Lastly, we'll talk about the Mississippi appendectomy. This is forced sterilization, the Relf sisters and IHS sterilization. So Fannie Lou Hamer reported being given a hysterectomy without consent in 1961. Popularizing awareness of coercive sterilization, the Mississippi appendectomy. Ralph B. Weinberger involved two Black sisters, 12 and 14, sterilized after their mother, who was illiterate, was misled about what she was signing. The case spotlighted widespread sterilization abuse, too many multisyllable words too early in the morning, in federally funded programs. And in 1976, GAO report investigated sterilizations in Indian Health Service facilities and contract facilities. And the GAO documentation is still accessible via GAO archives, we hope. You can also see a NLM timeline summaries of the GAO findings at nlm.nah.gov. So how does exploitation and research translate into mistrust in everyday healthcare today? For the panel.
Well, because the authority comes from, right, the scientific process, in my opinion, is when you talk about medicine, right? The reason why I'm trusting you to treat me is because you're trained in medicine, which is based on research and science, right? There's authority there, like I was saying earlier. So when that is tainted, when I can't trust that, when it maybe might just kill me, of course, why would you place all your trust in it? Actually, it's the same thing with banking systems and obviously police, emergency services. Oppressed communities in this nation routinely are much less engaged with institutions that benefit white America across the board. And that results in more and more disadvantage. I think there's a systemic PTSD among the Black community, probably collectively, but definitely among young Black men, that if I were a defense attorney of a young man in rural Texas, who I won't name, I would absolutely proffer a defense that, maybe racist America gave him a real good reason to be objectively concerned for imminent bodily harm. But
So this is an interesting, and I love this question, right? The Hippocratic Oath, right? First, do no harm, right? Seems to be one that, and that's of course, there's all kinds of versions of it, right? And different states and different hospitals and different schools use different versions. They've replaced the original Greek version with, they've replaced the pagan gods with more modern applications in the Hippocratic Oath. But what I can promise you as a Black American is that we know what's happened, right? We have our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents that have explained these things that are in front of our face that we're discussing here today. So when you ask, how do we think it impacts care? It impacts trust, which impacts our willingness to seek care, right? Because this isn't a matter of, oh, I'll get ignored, right? Maybe it's a matter of, we'll be misled and I'll get a hysterectomy. Maybe it's a matter of, I'll be ignored and I'll die on the table, right? And so do I seek care?
or can I afford to, $25,000 bill? You might.
Well, yeah. I mean, that, again, you can't separate the issues, right? You can't talk about one without talking about the other. So it's my piece.
And just to put a period at the end of the sentence, and the resistance to seek care becomes further bias. It becomes a further separation away from healthy health.
Yeah, I think when we historically, we look historically at how the minority body, Black body, Hispanic body, women's bodies have been used and viewed throughout American history, we see a consistent pattern. We don't really talk about the tens of thousands of mixed children that were born pre-Civil War, because white owners would have obviously sex with their female slaves. We don't have very good data on this, but some estimates consider tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of children that were mixed because of women's bodies, or should be Black women's bodies. Let's be very specific. This obviously goes into experimentation in how healthcare is applied. When you talk about examples throughout American history, Tuskegee is definitely number one. The second one that pops up for me is Puerto Rico. When it comes to, obviously, me being Puerto Rican, I think a lot about the birth control pills and the operations that were forced and the sterilizations that were forced on Puerto Rican women in the 40s and 50s under governors like Cornelius P. Rhodes that intentionally sought to sterilize as many women as possible with little to no consent or not fully understanding the risks of what they were doing. We have birth control pills today because they were tested unconsented on Puerto Rican women. And that's kind of going into exactly what we're talking about, right? This kind of practice has become so common throughout American history that we hear spurts here and there. We think they're one-offs rather than recognizing this is a symptom of the system. It is still perpetuating. It's not been rectified. There's no one's talking about reparations. No one's talking about, have we taken the methods and structures that led to these studies, that led to these injustices, and have we addressed them? Have we fixed them? The answer is no. The answer is we've not. And if we have, only in part. And I don't think we've fully addressed how this affects our modern view and usage of healthcare to Black and brown bodies.
We haven't addressed it at all, right? I mean, most people won't even entertain the idea of reparations. Well, why should I have to pay? When you talk about reparations, cash payments be a part of it, could land allocation, sure. There's a whole lot of ways, right? I think maybe we at least start by trying not to kill people. at exponential fucking rate. I'm sorry, y'all. At exponential rates. And the advances that we have benefited from at the cost of Black and brown bodies is outrageous. But nobody wants to look at that, right? Nobody wants to look at that. America has to look at that. We cannot continue to pretend like some of this shit is just not dark as hell, right? Like it's just not, I mean, for lack of better words, absolutely evil, right? Nefarious, it's greedy and selfish, and it's not human, in my opinion. Not the way we've talked about humanity on this show. And it's so insidious because I hear people talking about, you should be able to, like, they talk about, they circle words that resemble literacy tests or forced sterilization, right? Or, yeah, and I'm like, but do you want that? Where does that go traditionally, historically? Here, where do we put that? We put
So
that on Black and brown people and women, and you can try to equate it with education, but when you have multiple systems of oppression happening, where does that end up? Again, Black and brown people, you can't.
you said evil for lack of a better word.
Well,
There is no better word.
Yeah, and I think
Also, I will take this moment, sorry, just to plug my favorite ATL episode, Donald Glover, called The Big Payback, which is basically laying out how reparations could actually happen. Go check out the episode. I'm not going to spoil it for you. Go ahead, Joey.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we should talk about. I'm just going to make mention of it here. I'll push back that the Tuskegee experiment was the worst. I think the sterilization that was going on in Alabama was truly reprehensible. They were, sterilizing 100,000 to 150,000 young Black women annually through
without their knowledge.
through federally funded programs under the threat of losing welfare benefits in what still is today one of the poorest states in the union, who I believe they spend federal dollars at 6 times the rate, right, of other states in this union, right? So it was already poor then, it's still poor, and they got away with this between 1907 and 1970. This went on for 2 years? I don't know, it's early. Don't mind my math. 63 years, it's a long time.
Hell yeah, it's a long time.
And we see that we see uncomfortable echoes of that right now, right? In the discussion around SNAP benefits, right? Your kids are your responsibility, right? Nobody told you to have those kids. You should have thought of that before I won't go as crass into some of the comments that I've heard, but right. It's like that is uncomfortably rhyming with those same sentiments of, if you want to get wealth care, you have to cut yourself out from having more kids, because clearly this is a cultural problem and you can't stop yourself from having kids, is the underlying assumption under both statements.
But also, I will charge you with murder if you have a DNC at 12 weeks.
By the way, something that occurred to me earlier when you said PTSD, Bobby, is I think we need to coin a new term, which is STSD, systemic trauma. Instead of post-traumatic stress, it's systemic traumatic stress syndrome, because obviously we're not post, right?
Yeah. You knew, y'all got what I was talking about, right? And who I was talking about in general.
Yeah, of course.
But it's like battered women syndrome. Oh my God, shit.
Yep.
Yeah. And then,
okay. So statistics can show us patterns, but lived experience tells us what those patterns feel like. For many patients of color, navigating healthcare means preparing to advocate aggressively, rehearsing symptoms, bringing witnesses, bracing for dismissal. It means knowing that if you don't push, you may not be heard at all. Healthcare workers of color tell similar stories from the inside, watching colleagues dismiss patients, noticing whose concerns are taken seriously, and facing retaliation for speaking up.
and who's called a drug seeker for expressing
Say that
pain?
again?
Who's called a drug seeker for expressing pain?
These experiences are not isolated. They echo across cities, specialities, and generations. And when people share them, the response is often disbelief, which only reinforces the original harm. Listening isn't a courtesy in medicine. It's a diagnostic tool. And when entire groups are systematically not listened to, the outcomes become predictable. The stories matter because they reveal what the data alone can't, the emotional toll of being treated as a problem instead of a person who has a problem. So again, we talked about Serena Williams earlier, right? And we talked about Fannie Lou Hamer and the afterlife of coercion after she was sterilized against her will. So we kind of already touched that. We kind of already got here before we did. Is self-advocacy empowering, or is it a burden patients shouldn't have to carry?
I think that's a great question. It came into my mind earlier, and I will tell you this: it is a burden, but I do aggressively advocate for my own care. And an example I'll give is, I get shingles on my ear. Some of you may know that. I get shingles on my left ear, and for whatever reason, and this isn't even a drug, right? It's not even a narcotic, right? But what's used to treat it is, shingles are a herpetic outbreak that are a byproduct of the varicella vaccine. So if you've had chickenpox or the vaccination, you can be subject to it. It's not typical in somebody my age. But the point is, I'll go in there knowing that this is something, it never goes away, right? You don't get rid of it. Why is it that I can't get a prescription with refills? And so the last time I went in to urgent care under TRICARE through the military, the PA came in and she's like, so what's going on? I said, what's going on is that we're wasting government money for me to come in here and tell you about something that I don't need fucking diagnosed. I need you guys to put some, and this is my actual language. And she was taken aback by it. I said, this is something that I need you guys to give me a prescription with some fucking refills on, because by the time these symptoms onset, it becomes too late to really stop it because it's an antiviral, right? So I need this fixed. And she goes, that's ridiculous. And she gave me, finally, for the first time since I've been dealing with this in 5 years, something with three refills on it. So now, the next time it happens and the time after that, then I know, hey, I'm going to need a refill on this because my next time it's out. Those are the types of pieces of advocacy, and I aggressively advocate for myself, and I would recommend that minorities in this country do the same.
Anytime a particular demographic has to do something extra to get the same baseline treatment or care as the rest of society or as white society is absolutely a burden. Pushing back against a doctor, an expert, an authority figure isn't easy. And maybe they do a little bit and then they don't do it anymore. And then, they have detached placenta and bleed out in their bed. It's just not the same because the way that you are engaged in community, the way you're treated, the way you're taught to believe who you are, or any of these stereotypes about yourself affect the way that you engage with authority, right? Affect the confidence and ability to advocate for yourself. Education, even I know I was probably off when I got knocked off. If you're talking about Serena Williams, I mean, my God, if there is not a better example,
Yeah. You mentioned about men not going to the doctor, and thinking about it scientifically and what we're talking about suddenly flashed into focus. What if the reason men don't go to the doctor is because the system is set up to benefit people like me so we can get away with that? Whereas women and people of color instinctively, culturally have been trained, and maybe not consciously, that they need to get in there and start advocating for themselves earlier because it's going to take longer to get care.
Well, so there's one thing that I want to mention earlier, and I'll just go ahead and mention it now. There's a component of this, right, when we're talking about m- m- oppressed, minorities or women, Black and brown people. There is a component still that your property. This is point blank, period.
There's so many things that, in terms of the way that these systemic things reinforce and compound on each other, right? What if, and again, I'm not saying any of these things are true, but I'm thinking about this scientifically and trying to think about other variables that we need to isolate for when we're thinking about fixing these problems. What if another factor that gets preferential outcomes for white men is through insurance that understands that white men are more likely to have access to financial resources that allow us to sue? And so
So
you're going to get more treatment. You're going to get procedures approved at a higher rate than somebody who seems like maybe they don't have those resources.
yeah, I can't. I'm trying to really hard to stay on topic because this conversation can go so many ways, and I don't want to obviously derail it. But I guess just to kind of give the viewer and the listener a glimpse of what's going on in my own. is I'm looking at the patterns throughout the 20th century that have led to the disparities we have today. I'll just list out some few really quick. The idea that most of these social programs that benefit the Black and Brown community, that they are now being blamed for, and basically saying that they're lazy and they're not getting jobs and they're just living off of welfare. All of these programs were originally started to help the white community only. Whether we're talking about the New Deal, whether we're talking about the FHA, we can go on and on and on about how all these welfare programs assisted the white community,
The GI
got
Bill.
the GI Bill. You know, the FHA approved up to 40% of 40% of loans for 40% of white Americans between the 1948 when the FHA was created and the 1980s. So you're talking about a huge benefit, right? A huge government handout, if we will, right? That allowed them to establish themselves as the middle class, which was denied to those who came after them. So anyway, I'm thinking in my head, basically what I'm trying to say is when you take the totality of all the actions and systems and how racism has permeated every single aspect of them, it's difficult not to look at today and say, how should an individual advocate for themselves? The answer is unequivocally yes, obviously, in conjunction with other methods, right? Now, if we have an individual who's clearly taking their healthcare into their own hands, as they should, we need to start talking about coordinated efforts to combat this, right? Legislation, local and state elections, federal elections that can change these types of outcomes. But unfortunately, what's happening is that the majority of Americans, by the count of this last election of 2024, are being so convinced that these people are lazy, and what we should actually do is cut the leg that helps them and defund healthcare and Obamacare. And it's just like,
And who cares if it gets done?
if you only read history, if you only read where this stuff is coming from, you would understand that your assumptions are completely incorrect and filled with propaganda.
And who cares
So
if the kids drive, right? Well, your mama should have done better.
yeah.
Okay.
So, and of course, where I stray off topic is when we start to hit up against economic systems and, the failures of late stage capitalism, right? And, one of the things that, starts to align our incentives here is that the encroaching gears of capitalism are starting to grind on white people to where white people are starting to feel what marginalized communities have felt for decades, right? As institutionalized healthcare and insurance systems come online, we're getting listened to less. We're having less agency in our own healthcare because these decisions are being made elsewhere by moneyed interests that don't necessarily have our individual interests in mind. Sorry, let me land the plane, Bobby, just because connective tissue I want to make here. And in terms of correcting things, we're going to get there in a second, but in terms of correcting things, something that snapped into focus for me is even if you don't have an interest in racial equity for some moral blind spot that you have as an individual, if you want to make sure as a white person that the system works for you when you need it, make sure it works for the most marginalized, because then it'll work for you when the time comes. That's a plain landing, Bobby.
Okay. I'm just saying though, it's now not the perfect time for Dave Chappelle. Not in my streets, you don't. It's same thing with constitutional rights though, right? I mean, I can't have mine if you can't have yours. And therefore, I've got to take care of you, buddy. Take care of myself. And so at a minimum, if you don't give a shit about other people, care about yourself.
Yeah. I think last point I want to make that you made, Fingers, is unchecked capitalism is going to lead to inequality. These corporations, and everyone knows it. Everyone knows the inequalities that are perpetuated. A lot of it has to do with profit. A lot of it has to do with big pharma and big tech and all these things. I mean, just look at the outcry when Luigi gunned down that United Healthcare CEO. Left and right were ironically united in this idea where it's like, oh, thoughts and prayers kind of
How
thing.
horrible.
Yeah, how horrible. Like this guy who
And
benefited off of denying hundreds of thousands of people healthcare was denied life himself. And I personally did not celebrate it. That's a whole different conversation. But I think it's indicative of where we are right now in America, kind of thing, right? Where we are blaming the incorrect group. We're looking at the Black community and say, you guys are just lazy and whatever. horrific racist thing you could possibly say, that they're not taking personal responsibility, and yet you have corporations that are making trillions of dollars and somehow blaming the poor. It's just like, this is classic like hate yourself 101, right? This has happened time and time and time and time again throughout world history, throughout human history, right? Literally, you're shooting yourself in the foot. You're shooting your brother in the foot when the thieves have already left the house 2 hours ago with your TV and
If I
and
can
wallet.
And it
say
ties right into
that
environmental racism.
that Luigi allegedly shot that to
Yes,
you.
Yes,
allegedly.
yes, of
Thank you for
course,
protecting
allegedly.
us before we can afford attorneys other than our resident one, Joey. That was well thought ahead.
Like, you should all know your rights by
Yeah.
now, and if you don't, maybe call me.
Yeah.
Okay. If you want an attorney, you have to say it explicitly, not maybe or other. But I just want to say one thing about environmental racism. It ties into the government and corporate capture and deregulation and Black and brown communities across the South for sure. But you see it. I mean, there's plenty of stories, right? But it's
XAI in Memphis, environmental racism. The literal environment around communities of color is allowed to be degraded in the pursuit of profit by putting his gas turbines in to power his XAI initiative, which is causing respiratory health in the neighborhoods, which are mostly people of color, because they don't have the agency to advocate for themselves the same way that wealthy white neighborhoods do. The other point I wanted to make, and this seems like a good point to point this out, and people get uncomfortable when I point this out, the antebellum South was perfect capitalism. The cost of labor was driven near to zero, and all of the benefits and all of the profits of the industry in that society accrued to the men who created all those jobs. All right. So anytime this topic comes up, there's pushback. We've been talking about this. People say medicine is science and science can't be racist, or they argue it's about class, not race. We've kind of already debunked that with the Serena Williams example. Or they insist that doctors treat everyone the same. But treating everyone the same in an unequal system doesn't produce equal outcomes. And science is not immune to bias. It reflects the questions we ask, the data we collect, and the assumptions we bring with us. Denying medical racism doesn't protect good doctors. It protects bad systems. The goal here isn't to assign guilt. It's to recognize reality, because problems you refuse to name are problems you can't fix. Discomfort is not harm. For my people, one more time, discomfort is not harm. Ignoring harm is. So the good news here, though, is that medical racism is not inevitable. It's constructed, which means it can be dismantled. Change starts with acknowledging that race-based assumptions don't belong in medicine. It requires training that's tied to outcomes, not optics, transparency in data, accountability when patterns of harm appear. It also means empowering patients, encouraging second opinions, patient advocates, and systems that value listening as much as efficiency. I fucking hate that word efficiency since in the past 90, year and a half, by the way, because it's been perverted. Sidebar. Healthcare should not depend on how well you know how to argue your case while you're sick. Equity in medicine isn't about special treatment. It's about appropriate treatment for everyone. And so I want to bring the panel and the listeners' attention to two recent legislative efforts to address this. So there is a House Resolution 2884, Senate, if they call them bill or whatever, 1317, which is the Anti-Racism in Public Health Act of 2023. Congress.gov CRS summary says that this would establish a national center on anti-racism and health within the CDC and create a law enforcement violence prevention program, including activities like declaring racism a public health crisis, collecting, analyzing data, and administering research and grant programs. So the House bill, which was introduced and referred to the House Energy and Commerce Committee, same committee that oversees SNAP benefits and Medicaid, describes it as amending the Public Health Service Act to support public health research and investment into understanding and eliminating structural racism and police violence. What's interesting here is they treat racism as a public health issue, not a human resources training issue. They focus on infrastructure, on CD center, data, grants, and research, so the federal response isn't ad hoc and trying to address pieces here and there. And even when these bills don't pass quickly, and let's be real, these bills are dead on the water with the current administration and the current Congress. But they can set the agenda, they can shape agency priorities, and define what counts as a public health intervention. So something for the panel to think about: what reforms are real versus performative, do you think?
That's a big
Well,
question. That's a big question. I think, I don't know. What are your thoughts, Bobby? I'm very interested.
I think that the need for diversity in this field is important because it's not just, oh, oops, our bad. It's about, the humanity and the connections, I think, that exists with a lawyer and the client, a doctor and the patient, a Black person. My kids are biracial, and I've looked for a Black male doctor to treat them because, I just think that was an important connection. Make all the considerations because they see their kids, basically. They see someone who matters versus a drug seeker or a liar or a whatever. You don't have ADHD, you're just a brat. It's just the assumptions that come along with it. People don't even recognize the obesity, a lot of it. I've seen women be lectured on their weight only to have significant health issues overlooked. And so I think there's just a connection there where, marginalized communities have already shored each other up, and it's important to
Representation matters.
absolutely, absolutely right. Yeah, but also, maybe some of the like public health drives. I think anything in the medical field is probably not performative in my opinion, because anything that's sort of geared towards bringing awareness to an issue that may affects one community, not the other, still has some benefits. Me, I don't like blueberries or liberals. I don't know. What do y'all think?
So I think the key to understanding performative versus effective is enforcement mechanism. Right? There's a lot of legislation that's been out there, right? And also not just enforcement, but the ability to the necessity within legislation. And by the way, I think this makes most legislation performative by these standards, but the ability to enforce it and the ability to measure the outcomes to see if those outcomes,
yeah.
right, if those things, if this is having the intended effect. And
or
so
use a
I
commercial.
find, and look at, you look no further, right? And you guys know, I've broken down bills for some time. I kind of gave it up as we moved toward July, but from January to just July, there was an upward transfer of wealth of $5 trillion. If you looked at the title of any of these bills, boy, did it sound good, right? But they were stealing from the American people. They were hurting communities. The things that sounded good, there were no enforcement mechanisms for, and there was no instrument of measurement. Okay, this is the stated purpose of the bill. Okay, now when do we revisit this to see if the stated purpose is actually in fact the intended outcome?
So I want to come out swinging on this one and be very, very clear that real legislation is the ACA. Performative is repealing it. Let's be very, very clear about what real legislation is like versus being performative. The ACA by no means is perfect. No one's claiming it's perfect, but it provided healthcare for over 30 million Americans that could not afford it, that had pre-existing conditions, that didn't have healthcare. Now they do. Okay. And now the Republicans want to repeal it with no plan to replace it. That is performative. They're simply doing this based on a fucking narrative that people are lazy. ACA is communism and socialism come to America, and we need more unfettered capitalism, is what that performative bullshit is. Let's be very, very clear about what that is.
And I think that ties into what he was saying, right? You saw, it targets the audience. I say the audience, but, the constituents that need help. It is effective in reducing the cost and providing care to low-income Americans. And I don't understand it. They have to capture the narrative, right? We've talked about the narrative so much. You have to capture it because otherwise, who the fuck is just going to let you do this to their neighbors? Like, I'm sorry, you want to do what? But I know, Susie, what do you mean? I don't want her to be hungry or not have health. They can't tell you.
Yeah, and with the ACA specifically, so much of the criticism is like, oh, well, this is just putting money in the pockets of the insurance industry. Yeah, because that's all you would let us do. And now you come back and pretend to be on your high horse and talk about how the Dems didn't have a plan and the Dems plan is all fucked up.
You
and the
fucking
Dems
commie.
plan has ruined anything when the Dems were the only one who had a fucking plan and it barely passed to begin with because y'all didn't have a plan then. The only fucking idea the right has had in this country for 4 fucking decades is no.
I love
Sorry. Do I sound passionate? I'm sorry. The coffee must be kicking in.
You sound
My
correct.
usual decorum has been eroded.
You sound correct, is what you sound. And
Can you hear my contempt?
one time
for those-
on
your voice
a
is dripping with it. Yes.
one time on a live, Jesse told somebody that I was about as subtle as a gun.
I forgot about that.
Talking about differences, like, promise you, if I give that rant, I will be treated as forceful and strong. And if you give that rant, you'll be treated as a bitch.
Don't we know?
Yeah, we do know. And those of us that love you will stand up for you, Bobby. Even though we know we don't need to.
Because I'm not very subtle, am I, Jesse? No, I'm just playing. Yeah, I appreciate that, Ron.
Yeah,
just
I mean, and to pivot off Jeffy's point about this being performative, Mike Johnson stands up in front of the world and says, oh, no, we're the ones that protect your health care. We're the ones protecting affordability.
Mm.
You know, Trump has said since entering public life, he has a health care plan coming any minute now. And they have concepts of a plan. And let's be real, the only thing they can think of that would be better, because it's kind of the only thing anybody can think of in the US that would be better, is single payer. But that's not the answer they want. And they can't figure something out that is not single payer that would actually generate better outcomes. And so the only answer is no.
Yeah. I mean, the crazy thing is like the extremes they will go to justify the no. Well, yeah, you want socialism. But these countries, Sweden, all of the countries who outrank us in lifespan, health, happiness, per capita spending, are not socialist countries. They have a capitalist system, and they just have, universal healthcare where it's not, you don't rank a profit over human life. And they talk again the narrative. Well, you'll be waiting forever. Sure, I guess if you want lip injections, right? Maybe at some point you're
You
gonna
wait forever here. You wait forever already.
Oh my gosh, that's what I'm telling. I said, what is forever for an elective procedure? When you talk about not getting not getting chemotherapy, not getting life-saving treatment. My dad had a valve replacement, a heart valve replacement, when I was in high school. It bankrupted us, as it does most Americans. And sure, if you get there, right, and they lean every asset you have, everything is rebuilt. I mean, our school, literally, our high school, took up a donation for us. We shared a room at 16, me and my brother. I mean, I guess you're right. I'd hate to have to wait
So
to have a
we
bunion
cannot
shaved.
call a capitalist society just an efficiency perfect and claim that capitalism as we practice it is perfect.
It's murderous.
When a kid doing a fundraiser to pay off his classmates' lunchroom debt is considered a heartwarming story instead of a signpost of dystopia, right? By the way, so, you mentioned the Scandinavian countries, and something that I want people to think about, and it's going to be uncomfortable for some people, and that's by design, is that people that don't believe in the Scandinavian model do not believe in capitalism. They do not believe in the good parts of capitalism. Because what Scandinavia and most Western industrialized countries do is take the benefits of capitalism and connect that engine to social welfare. They trust in capitalism and market mechanisms and free markets and making sure that there is actually free markets in an economy. So much they base their social safety nets on the idea that those markets will continue to produce. And so people, when they say that can't be done, it'll break things, you're arguing that capitalism is weaker than it actually is.
Well, and also, right, this whole, I want small government. Sure, I guess when DuPont is, poisoning your water, or there's sewage in your backyard,
The
or
least free society you can have.
kind of medicine you
The
can take.
least free society you can have. Well,
Right.
is if there's no government to advocate for you against those who have more money.
I've said this a lot, right? The big government versus small government argument is a bad one, in my opinion, because the whole fact of the matter is that you don't need something that's unregulated. You don't need something that's overregulated. You need thoughtful regulation. And we see that in some of these successful, postmodern capitalist industrialized societies that have social safety nets. We see this exact thing, right? And the example I always give, and I think I've given it on this show before, right? In one of the European countries, I forget which one off the top of my head right now. I want to say it's Denmark. They don't say, well, we're going to limit how much you're allowed to pay your CEO. They say you can pay your CEO as much as you want, but the distance between your highest paid employee and your lowest paid employee can only be this much, right? So if he's winning a $50 million, everybody's winning, right? That is a thoughtful regulation, right? That is not a burdensome, no, you can't pay him whatever. I don't care how successful he is, you can't pay him more. It's simply thoughtful. That is what we need.
And also, I mean, there are certain things that we're talking about right now with healthcare and income and standard of living that makes society more cohesive. It is the reason why it's worth living in. But, you know what I mean? And also, they're like, oh, look, they don't come for it. They'll just leave. We are the largest consumer base on Earth. Get creative. Fucking restrict it.
You're
That's
trying to
fine.
trigger me,
If you don't
aren't
want to
you?
invest in the American people, you won't fucking sell it to them. And we know how much they like bullshit. So take your choice.
So let's just, I know you did this to trigger me, body. Like the they'll leave argument. It's like, good, fuck off to Dubai. Your assets which generate your wealth are still here. Your real estate portfolio is here. We will tax that. The companies that you own shares in are here. We will tax those dividends. The markets that you participate in are here. If you want to forego participation in those markets so that you can fuck off Dubai, please be my guest. Please sell those assets so somebody else has a chance to buy those assets to participate in this market who wants to actually contribute to the well-being of this country. Get the fuck out of here with your stupid, oh, they'll leave as if that's a bad thing argument. I'm no longer triggered.
I just also want to mention real quick in terms of healthcare, the United States spends more per person and overall on healthcare than any other nation on earth.
Yeah.
The idea that we can't afford it is pure fucking propaganda bullshit. Like, it is absolutely fucking asinine. This idea that the United States government is a $31 trillion GDP every single fucking year. The only country even close to us is China at 18 or 19 trillion, and they have universal health care. Germany, I think, has an economy of like $10 trillion. They have universal health care. We are the richest country on the planet, and yet somehow it wouldn't work here. Is fucking asinine.
It's an abusive relationship, basically. No, you take what you get because they'll leave if you don't. Okay.
Good. Please do.
And also for anyone who this topic always gets me, but for anyone who is saying that, oh, it makes healthcare worse, there are a myriad of studies that just prove this wrong, right? There are other factors that lead into why certain systems of universal healthcare may not work, such as workforce, such as underfunding, so on and so forth. But universal healthcare itself inherently is not a bad system. I mean, look at Germany. Germany is a great example of this.
People die
It's
of
both better in
root canals.
theory. It's better in theory too, right? If you just think about it for 20 seconds, it becomes obvious, right? There's no reason why you should have a middleman. There's no economic reason to compel why all this should have to be passed through a third person. This is pure rent seeking. If you're an Austrian school economist, like, this is obviously rent seeking. There is no argument by which this is going to yield better outcome. Or it should be better stated that if you think it's going to yield better outcomes, you are claiming that it is going to have orders of efficiency that are of much greater magnitude than it does. And, then to Jesse's point, that theory, that common sense analysis is borne out by the data.
Last time y'all went to the emergency room, but there's no reason in hell. Ibuprofen 800 should cost you $150. One pill. Open your mouth.
Insulin's like $10 in some other countries and $1,500 here. Why? Because it's somehow more expensive to make here? Of course not. It's because we have a regulatory regime and legislative regime that says, oh, no, you can't negotiate. These fucking free market fucks that claim that the pricing mechanism of free market is perfect, which is the only part of the story they get right, refuse to allow the pricing mechanism to be in operation to protect big pharma. Anyway, it is clear. It is clear. We have an episode on healthcare that we're all dying to do, right? Supposedly, this is about medical racism, and it's become a discussion about healthcare at large, and there's a lot to say there, right? I think hopefully this, for the audience, again, my intent here, aside from like trying to fill in a blind spot for myself, that these bills existed and that we should be advocating for them, even if we know that the current iteration of Congress will not be receptive. Maybe we'll be in place to push on the gas on these kinds of things when we get a different Congress in place. But also because I feel like this is a good way to illustrate what is meant by structural racism, what is meant by systemic racism. Everybody in the system can have the purest of intentions, can be as non-racist as they can be in their individual lives, have worked hard to dismantle bigotry within themselves, and still be perpetuating racist outcomes because the system itself has history baked into it that had assumptions that have gone unexamined. And that is what we mean when we talk about structural racism writ large in the country, much less within the medical system. So with that, I'll throw it to the panel for final thoughts.
Y'all froze a little bit for me, but my final thoughts are, um, you cannot have an equitable society without health and wealth, and not here. Health, wealth, and rights. Those things are sort of the powerhouse of communities. That means equity in race and healthcare and the law and intergenerational wealth. I think those are markers of where our society is going. And we can say all day, "Oh, I'll say the N-word." Cool, but what are you doing about any of this? And also, because white people, like, I mean, my best friend's black. Great. Can you really say you love them if you don't give a shit if their daughter dies having a baby? You I don't get too far off, but their son happens to pick up your white kid's toy pew pew and make it 30 past the arrival of a cop car in a park. You can't say you love people if you're silent. That's why we talk about silence and being complicit and colorblind is not a good thing. You have to see the inequities of society to remedy them. Otherwise, you're basically just saying, "Shut up and get out of my face." You don't do that to people else. And you want to do it to my fucking kids. All right, I guess.
So, as the closing optimist, I will remind everybody listening to this show, right, who potentially is personally offended, who feels, if you haven't switched and you're still listening, you haven't turned us off yet. We're not making the claim that everybody is racist. But when there is a racist outcome, we must look at it. And I'd like to remind all the listeners, the United States of America, in terms of, what do we call it, developed nations, is still among the youngest. And I think that there's wisdom in looking at the systems that have developed, right? Let's read Europe, Scandinavia, that started out as a feudal system, right? And eventually moved on, and look at those advanced societies. Look at their levels of happiness, their levels of health, their life expectancy, their maternal mortality rates. And you will find that those older societies have an arc. We have that arc. Eventually, this country will have much better outcomes for people. The faster we look at it, the faster we can get there. Thanks for listening.
It wouldn't be an episode if I don't recommend a book. So I'm going to recommend a couple books. First off, let me say, go read a fucking book. Please read a book. Challenge yourself, grapple with the text. If you need to do Audible, that's perfectly fine. That totally counts. But read a book. Stop the YouTube. Stop the TikToks. Stop the Instagram reels. Go read a book. I cannot stress that enough, because the more you read, the more you realize you're just like, oh my God, like, I'm contending with information that my brain is grappling with that I have to now realize is reality, kind of thing. Anyway,
I'll see you on TikTok tonight, Jesse.
Yeah. Some books I recommend in terms of topics about this, but generally speaking about systemic racism in general. There are some, I've not read any, but I'm going to give some. There are some books about the racial disparities in the healthcare system that did exist. I want to shout out like one or two of them. One of them is called Body and Soul by Alondra Nelson. It's called The Black Party in the Fight Against against medical discrimination. There's another one called Dying While Black by Vernilla Randall. And there's many, many, many others on this specific medical practice, what we're talking about. If you are looking for something that is just more generic, like racial disparities and other things like housing and whatnot, I highly recommend these 3 books. I've not read the other 2 by Desmond yet that I really want to, but there's Evicted in Poverty by America. He looks specifically at how he argues that poverty isn't just a byproduct, but it is a systematic, intended outcome by certain entities. I'll leave it at that, basically, which obviously overwhelmingly disproportionately affect minority communities. I recommend this book earlier, in other episodes and in this one, Color of Law by Richard Rossi, and cannot recommend this one enough. It will fundamentally change your understanding of redlining. It's just incredible. And then lastly, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which I highly recommend as well. It talks about the criminal justice system and how we are living in a new age of mass incarceration that is intended. So you don't have to read these books. You can read another book, but please read a book, because the more you read, the more you realize the absolute buffoonery that's happening right now and the misinformation going online. So with all that, I will end it. Thanks.
One quick
And
thing
we
on
will put
books.
links to the. Sorry, go ahead. Joey.
Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington is another one, and that takes you all the way from the history of medical experimentation on Black Americans all the way from the colonial period to present. Okay, so another very specific and good example.
Yeah, we will put links to these books in the show notes so people have simple access to find them.
In our coming Discord.
Giving it away, Jesse. Jesus.
You can edit
We
that out,
actually
dude.
have plans, folks. 2026 is going to be a year we're going to try to step on the gas a little bit with what we're trying to do here. Now that we're getting our feet under ourselves a little bit, we understand what this podcast is and what it's intended to do. I think, as I said earlier, the discussions here demonstrate we clearly have an episode on healthcare that we need to do. There's an episode that I think we need to do on civic engagement with Joey about how to look at bills and whether they're effective, whether they're performative. I think these are episodes that would be useful. But yeah, so 2026, we're going to get even more disorderly. That was cheesy, but I couldn't help myself.
No, it's great.
Medical racism isn't a policy failure or a training issue. It's a moral one. It asks us whether we're willing to believe people when they say they're hurting, even when their experiences challenge our assumptions. That's true for racism writ large, folks. Whenever the topic, we said earlier on, if you're a white person who's more offended by being called racist than you are by the existence of racism, you need to do some self-examination. This isn't about the past either. It's about those who survive in the present and who will survive the present, and whether the systems we trust to care for us are willing to change when they're shown to be failing. Silence has never healed anyone. Accountability might. So thanks for listening to Disorderly Conduct. We will be talking at you next week again. Until then, stay dangerous. Thank you for listening to the Disorderly Conduct Podcast, a production of the Public Integrity Network. We believe that the first step to taking back our democracy is getting money out of politics. Come find us at moneyoutofpolitics.org and we'll put you to work. In the meantime, get involved in your community. Volunteer at a soup kitchen. Start a rideshare service. Go to school board meetings. Anything you can to make sure this government remembers that their powers derive from the consent of the governed.